When I saw the photograph on the museum wall, my knees almost gave out. It was an old black and white image, cracked and faded, but there was no mistaking the face staring back at me. It was my grandmother. And right beside her was a man the town called a murderer. I remember gripping the edge of the display case, my palms slick with sweat, trying to steady myself. The air inside that tiny town museum felt heavy, like history itself was pressing down on my chest. Behind me, tourists murmured softly, snapping photos of artifacts and war medals, completely unaware that the woman in that photo had just shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. That moment, that single photograph, would change my entire understanding of who we were. And of what this town had buried for generations. I grew up in a quiet place, the kind of small town where everyone knew each other's business, or at least pretended to. Maple Hollow sat on the edge of nowhere, all weathered barns and whispering cornfields, the kind of place where gossip moved faster than the wind. My parents owned a modest hardware store on Main Street, and our lives were as steady as the ticking clock that hung behind the counter. My mother, Ruth, was the kind of woman who believed in keeping up appearances. Her hair was always pinned neatly, her dresses pressed crisp even in the summer heat. My father, Harold, was gentler. He had calloused hands and a soft voice that could calm even the most irritable customer. And then there was Grandma June, my father's mother, who lived in a small cottage just outside town. She was different. June had a quiet way about her, the kind that drew you in without a word. She always smelled faintly of lavender and cedarwood, and her kitchen was a treasure chest of old stories. But there was something else about her too, a sadness that clung to her like the dust motes that danced in her window light. As a child, I thought she was simply nostalgic. As an adult, I realized she was haunted. Sundays were sacred in our family. After church, we'd all gather at Grandma June's for lunch, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and her famous apple pie cooling on the sill. The grown-ups would talk politics or weather, and I'd sit by the old radio, listening to her hum along to songs from the 1940s. One afternoon, when I was maybe 12, I asked her why she never went into town much. Her hand froze midair, the silver knife glinting as she sliced the pie. "Oh, honey," she'd said softly, her voice trembling just slightly. "Some stories are better left buried." My father gave her a look, a quiet warning, and the room fell silent. At the time, I didn't understand. Now I wish I had asked more. Years passed. I left Maple Hollow for college, then for work. The town faded into something distant, a postcard memory. I built a life in the city, a world away from the quiet streets of my childhood. My parents stayed behind, still running the store, still sending me care packages filled with homemade jams and small-town news. When Grandma June passed away, I couldn't make it home for the funeral. Work had kept me away, or maybe it was guilt. She'd died in her sleep, they said. Peacefully. But the night I got the call, I sat up in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I'd missed something important. Something final. It wasn't until 3 years later, when I returned home to help my mother downsize after my father's stroke, that I found myself face to face with the ghost she'd warned me about. The museum had just opened its new exhibit, Maple Hollow Through the Ages. It was supposed to be a celebration of our town's proud history, its founding families, its local heroes, its small-town charm. Mom had insisted we go, said it might lift Dad's spirits. So we went. I remember pushing his wheelchair through the narrow aisles, past displays of old tools, faded photographs, and letters from soldiers who never came home. It all felt harmless, until we reached the back wall. There, in the section labeled The Town Scandal of 1948, hung the photo that stopped my heart. A group of people stood outside a courthouse. Among them, unmistakable even in grainy grayscale, was my grandmother, June Carter. Next to her stood a man with dark eyes and a rigid jawline. The caption read, "Local farmer accused in the Carter affair, case dismissed after disappearance of key witness." The Carter affair. I'd never heard of it. But Carter was her maiden name. "Mom," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "Did you know about this?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Put that out of your mind, sweetheart," she murmured, pushing Dad's wheelchair toward the next display. That was a long time ago. But I couldn't move. Something in my chest ached, not just from confusion, but from the sense that a truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that photograph played over and over in my head. My grandmother's eyes, wide, pleading, seemed to stare straight through me. I could almost hear her voice again, "Some stories are better left buried." But what if the story that was buried was ours? I went into the attic the next morning, searching through boxes of old letters and photos. The air smelled of mothballs and cedar, and sunlight spilled through the small round window in fractured beams. I sifted through everything, baby clothes, Christmas ornaments, school certificates, until I found a small wooden box at the bottom of a trunk. It was locked. And on the lid, scratched faintly into the wood, were 2 letters, JC. My grandmother's initials. I didn't know it then, but opening that box would unravel not just her secrets, but the entire history of Maple Hollow itself. I took the wooden box downstairs and set it on the kitchen table. Morning light poured through the lace curtains, dusting everything in pale gold. My father was napping in the living room, and Mom was outside watering her roses, the same ones she'd planted when I was little. I turned the box over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It wasn't heavy, but it felt significant, like it held something that didn't want to be found. The lock was small, an old brass latch worn smooth by time. I tried to pry it open with a butter knife, but it didn't budge. Then, as I tilted it slightly, something rattled inside. A faint metallic clink. My heart jumped. There was a small drawer in the hallway where Mom kept spare keys, most of them long forgotten. I rummaged through it, and, almost miraculously, found a tiny skeleton key tied to a faded blue ribbon. It looked about the right size. I slid it into the lock, and with a quiet click, the box opened. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. They were bundled in twine, the edges yellowed and soft. The handwriting was unmistakably my grandmother's, neat cursive, graceful and deliberate. Beneath the letters lay a single photograph, folded in half. I unfolded it carefully, and my stomach turned cold. It was the same man from the museum photo, the one they'd called a murderer. And he was standing next to June, smiling. His hand rested gently on her shoulder. On the back, written in pencil, were just 3 words. For us, forever. I sat there for a long time, staring at the photo, my thoughts tangled. I knew my grandmother had been widowed young, her husband, my grandfather, had supposedly died in a farming accident before my father was even born. But something about that photo didn't fit that story. The man beside her didn't look like a husband. There was something secret in their pose, something tender, but also dangerous. I untied the letters and began to read. The first one was dated July 1947. My dearest June. You were right, they'll never understand. The town is too small for secrets, but my heart is too full to care. If loving you is a sin, then I'll carry it gladly. Yours always, T. I froze. T. Who was T? The next few letters painted a clearer picture, a forbidden romance between my grandmother and this man. They met at the edge of the Carter farm, sometimes at the river by Miller's Bridge. They talked about running away, starting fresh somewhere far from Maple Hollow. But then, the tone shifted. The later letters were shorter, more frantic. Words crossed out. Ink smudged by what might have been tears. June, they're watching me. Your brother came by the barn again, I think he knows. Please, don't tell anyone about the papers. Burn them if you can. It's safer that way. Papers? What papers? I flipped through more pages, my hands trembling. The last letter was dated March 1948, just months before the museum's scandal date. If anything happens to me, tell them I didn't do it. You know the truth, about your father, about the land, about the money. Promise me you won't let them bury it again. Then it ended abruptly. No signature. just a smudge of ink at the bottom. When I looked up, the kitchen felt unfamiliar, too bright, too still. I heard the faint sound of my mother's watering can outside, the rhythmic splash of water against soil. Everything seemed normal, yet nothing was. I tucked the letters back into the box and slipped the photo into my pocket. I didn't want Mom to see, not yet. I needed to understand what I was looking at first. That evening, after Dad went to bed, I brought up the photo again. "Mom," I started carefully, "what do you remember about Grandma's life before Dad was born?" She looked up from her knitting, her brow furrowed. "Why?" I found some old letters. And a photo. She's with a man I don't recognize." Her expression hardened. "You shouldn't go digging into the past, sweetheart. It won't do any good." "Mom, who was he?" I pressed. The caption at the museum said something about a trial, about a scandal in 1948. She sighed, setting her knitting aside. "Your grandmother went through a lot, more than you can imagine. People said cruel things. She was a good woman, she didn't deserve what happened." "What happened?" Mom hesitated, her lips trembling. "It's better if you ask your father," she said finally. "He might remember more than I do." But when I asked Dad the next morning, he only shook his head weakly. "Leave it alone, kiddo," he murmured. "Some truths don't belong in daylight." The next day, I drove back to the museum. The curator, an elderly man named Mr. Gibbons, was shelving books behind the counter. His glasses slid halfway down his nose as he looked up. "Back again," he said with a smile. "You locals always come twice, first to remember, then to question." I managed a nervous laugh. "I'm doing a bit of family research." "The Carter affair, do you know what that was about?" He adjusted his glasses. "Ah, the old scandal. Nasty business, that. A young farmer was accused of killing a man, the town's mayor back then, Thomas Avery. But the case fell apart when a key witness vanished. Some say she ran off, others say she was paid to keep quiet." A chill crept down my spine. A witness. My grandmother's photo had been taken outside the courthouse that same day. "Do you remember the farmer's name?" I asked. Gibbons nodded slowly. "Truman Avery. The mayor's own brother. T." The letters were signed T. I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. So Grandma's secret lover, the man she wrote to, had been accused of murdering his own brother. And she was the missing witness. I left the museum trembling. The late afternoon sun was low and gold, stretching long shadows across Main Street. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the box on the passenger seat, wondering what kind of woman my grandmother really was. Was she in love with a killer? Or had she been protecting him, protecting something bigger? Either way, one thing was clear: Maple Hollow's hidden history wasn't just about the town. It was about us. And I wasn't ready to stop digging. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the house sounded louder than usual, every tick of the kitchen clock more deliberate, like time itself was daring me to stop digging. But I couldn't. The more I tried to let it go, the louder my grandmother's words echoed in my head: "Some stories are better left buried." Except this one refused to stay buried. By morning, I had made up my mind: I was going to find out what happened in 1948. Maple Hollow's town archives were kept in the basement of the old library. The air down there smelled of dust and paper decay, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched like narrow corridors, filled with forgotten decades. The librarian, Mrs. Heath, looked surprised when I asked about the Carter affair. "Oh," she said, lowering her voice. "That old tragedy? You're too young to remember, but that shook the town for years." She led me to a stack of bound newspapers and handed me a pair of gloves. "Be careful with them. Those pages have seen more gossip than truth." I flipped through the yellowed pages until I found it: the Maple Hollow Gazette, April 3, 1948. The headline read: Mayor Thomas Avery found dead, brother arrested in connection. My throat went dry as I read on. Mayor Avery was discovered early Sunday morning in his study, the apparent victim of blunt force trauma. His brother, local farmer Truman Avery, was taken into custody after witnesses reported a heated argument the previous evening concerning land deeds and family inheritance. Family inheritance. Further down, a smaller column caught my eye. A young woman identified as June Carter, daughter of landowner Franklin Carter, was called to testify but failed to appear. Sources close to the case suggest her testimony could have cleared Avery of all charges. I stared at the words until they blurred. My grandmother hadn't just known Truman. She could have saved him. But she disappeared instead. I spent the rest of the day poring over the records, piecing together fragments of what happened. The case had collapsed when June vanished, and Truman Avery had been released for lack of evidence. He'd left town shortly after and was never seen again. The papers never mentioned where June went, only that she returned years later, already married, already changed. When I got home that evening, Mom was in the kitchen, humming softly as she sliced apples for pie. The scent filled the air, warm, sweet, familiar. But the comfort of it didn't reach me. "Mom," I said quietly, setting the newspaper on the counter. "Why didn't you ever tell me about the murder?" "About Grandma?" Her knife paused mid-slice. "Where did you get that?" she asked, her voice thin. "The library archives." "Mom, she was a witness. They said she disappeared during the trial." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw something break in her, a kind of weariness that went deeper than age. "She didn't disappear," she whispered. "She was sent away." "Sent away?" "She was pregnant, honey." The words hit me like a physical blow. I grabbed the edge of the counter for balance. "Pregnant, with Truman's child?" I asked, barely able to say it. Mom's silence was answer enough. She sat down heavily, her eyes distant. "Your grandmother was 20 when she met Truman. He was married then, unhappily, but still married. People in town whispered, of course. When the mayor found out about the affair, he threatened to ruin her family. Her father, your great-grandfather, was terrified. The Carters owned half the farmland back then. Their reputation meant everything." I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. "Then, when the mayor turned up dead," Mom continued, "everyone assumed Truman did it. June was supposed to testify that he'd left before the fight, but your great-grandfather wouldn't let her. He locked her in the house the night before the trial. By morning, she was gone, smuggled out by a cousin and sent to a church home 2 counties over. They wanted her to give the baby up, but she refused." My chest tightened. "So what happened to the baby?" Mom's eyes met mine, a heavy, knowing look that made my stomach twist. "You're looking at his grandchild." I froze. "What?" She nodded slowly. "Your father was that baby." The world went silent. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, everything seemed to fade. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But it wasn't. My father, the man who'd raised me, the man I'd thought came from a quiet, respectable family, was the son of a forbidden love. The grandson of a man accused of murder. And that meant the Avery bloodline and the Carter family weren't just linked by scandal, they were one and the same. I thought of the old men who'd whispered in the hardware store, the polite smiles that had always followed my family name. It wasn't respect they carried, it was secrecy. "How long have you known?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Since before I married your father," Mom said softly. "June told me after he was born. She didn't want the town to judge him for sins that weren't his. She swore me to silence, said the truth would only hurt him." "And Dad?" "He never knew." I pressed my palms to my temples, the weight of generations crashing down on me. "He deserves to know," I said. Mom shook her head, tears welling. "He's too fragile now. What good would it do? He's lived a good life. Let him keep it that way." But I couldn't agree. The truth was clawing at my chest, begging to be spoken, to be seen. That night, I went to my father's room. He was awake, sitting by the window in his wheelchair, staring out at the darkened fields. The moonlight cast his face in silver and shadow. "Dad," I began quietly, "did Grandma ever tell you who your father was?" He looked up, eyes weary but clear. "She said he was gone before I was born." "She never mentioned a name?" He shook his head. "No. Just that he loved her once." I hesitated, my throat tightening. I wanted to tell him everything. But then I saw the way he looked out at the night sky, his expression peaceful, even fragile. And I couldn't do it. Not yet. Instead, I reached for his hand and said softly, "She loved you very much, Dad. More than you know." He smiled faintly, and for a moment, the weight of the secret sat quietly between us, unspoken but understood. Still, deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Because if the town had built its peace on a buried lie, then it was only a matter of time before someone else unearthed it. And this time I needed to be ready. After that night, I couldn't think about anything else. The truth had burrowed itself into my chest like a splinter, small, but impossible to ignore. Every time I looked at my father, I saw layers of history I hadn't noticed before, the way his jawline mirrored the man in the photograph, the way his quiet strength resembled Grandma June's steadiness. It was strange, how bloodlines could hide in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. But the story wasn't complete yet. There was still one missing piece: what really happened the night the mayor died. 2 days later, I drove out to the old Carter property. It had been abandoned for decades, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, the barn sagging against the weight of time. My father had sold it years ago, but no one ever moved in. Locals said the land was cursed. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes as I walked toward the porch. The air was heavy with the smell of rain-soaked earth and rust. Through the broken windows, I could see fragments of the past: an overturned chair, a cracked photograph frame, dust-coated walls that once echoed with voices. Something in me trembled, not from fear, but from reverence. This was where it had all begun. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I ran my fingers along the peeling wallpaper, wondering which room had been my grandmother's, where she'd written those letters. The quiet was deafening, except for the soft tap of dripping water somewhere deeper in the house. I found what must have been her old bedroom. The faded lace curtains still clung to the windows, and in the corner stood a trunk, almost identical to the one I'd found her box in. My pulse quickened. When I opened it, dust exploded into the air, swirling in the shaft of light from the window. Inside were old linens, a few books, and at the very bottom an envelope sealed with red wax. The initials on it read T.A. My breath caught. Truman Avery. The paper inside was brittle, but the ink was surprisingly clear. To whomever finds this: if I am gone, know this: I did not kill my brother. He discovered something about the Carter land, something that would have ruined both our families. The papers June has will tell the truth. Protect her. If she's alive, tell her I never stopped loving her. Truman Avery. I sank to the floor, letter trembling in my hands. The papers. The same ones he'd mentioned in the letters I'd found in Grandma's box. But she hadn't kept them there. So where were they? That night, I couldn't shake the thought. I sat at the kitchen table with both boxes open in front of me, one filled with her letters, the other with the note I'd found at the farm. Mom had gone to bed early, exhausted, and Dad was asleep in the next room. I reread Truman's last words over and over. The papers June has will tell the truth. Then it hit me. When I was little, Grandma used to tell me stories about a secret garden behind her house. It wasn't really a garden, just a patch of wild daisies near the oak tree. She'd always make me promise to leave one stone untouched. "That's my lucky charm," she used to say, smiling in that wistful way of hers. What if it wasn't just superstition? At sunrise, I drove to her old cottage. The air smelled of dew and honeysuckle, and birds were already darting between the branches. The garden was still there, overgrown but familiar. The oak tree stood like a sentinel, its bark gnarled and proud. I found the flat stone right where she'd said. I knelt down and brushed away the dirt. It was heavier than I remembered, but when I lifted it, something glinted beneath. A small tin box. Rusted, sealed tight. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were several folded papers, deeds, letters, and one official-looking document stamped with a county seal. I unfolded the largest one and read it under the morning light. Property transfer, Carter Family Holdings to Thomas Avery, 1947. Condition, to be held in trust pending approval of joint agricultural project, funds to be reallocated to the Avery estate upon default. It took a moment for the words to register, then it hit me. The mayor, Thomas Avery, had been trying to steal the Carter land. Legally. Quietly. And Truman had found out. No wonder they'd fought that night. And no wonder my grandmother had been silenced. She'd been carrying proof that the murder had been over fraud, that her lover wasn't the villain the town made him out to be. My chest burned with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. For 70 years, my grandmother had lived under a cloud of shame, branded as the girl who ran away, the girl who betrayed her family. But she hadn't been a coward. She'd been protecting them. And all this time, the town's hidden history had been nothing but a lie, one told to protect the powerful and bury the innocent. I knew what I had to do next. The following Monday, I walked into the Maple Hollow Historical Society with the box in my hands. The same curator, Mr. Gibbons, looked up from his desk, surprised to see me again. "I think your exhibit is missing something," I said quietly. He chuckled. "Oh? You found another old photograph?" I set the documents on his desk and slid Truman's letter across the surface. His expression changed instantly. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the pages, his hand trembling slightly as he read. "Where did you get these?" he whispered. "They belonged to my grandmother, June Carter," I said. "And they proved Truman Avery wasn't guilty." For a long time, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "My word, this changes everything." "Yes," I said, voice firm. "It does." We spent the next few hours reviewing the papers. Gibbons promised to submit them for authentication and to revise the town's records. He even said they'd update the museum exhibit, replace the old headline with the truth. As I walked out of the building, the autumn sun felt warmer somehow, and the air seemed lighter. For the first time, Maple Hollow didn't feel like a place of buried ghosts. It felt like a place finally ready to breathe again. But the hardest part was still ahead, telling my parents. That evening, I sat with them at the kitchen table. Mom looked worried when she saw the box. "I went back to Grandma's cottage," I said. "I found something she left behind." Dad looked up, curious but calm. "What kind of something?" I placed Truman's letter in front of him. "It's from your father," I said softly. He blinked, confusion clouding his face. "My father?" "Yes," I whispered. "His name was Truman Avery. And he wasn't a murderer." The silence that followed was thick and trembling. He reached for the letter with shaky hands, his eyes scanning each line. Then, slowly, tears filled them. For a long time, none of us spoke. Finally, Dad said, voice breaking, "All my life, I thought I came from nothing, but she was just trying to protect me." I squeezed his hand. "She loved you more than anything. She carried this secret so you could live free from it." He nodded, tears sliding down his weathered cheeks. "Then it's time the town knows who we really are." The news spread through Maple Hollow faster than I expected. By midweek, the Historical Society had verified the documents, and the local paper ran a front-page story. "Truman Avery exonerated, new evidence reveals decades-old cover-up." The photo beneath the headline was hauntingly familiar, that same black-and-white image of Truman and my grandmother standing under the oak tree. Only this time, the caption didn't read "Suspect and Unknown Woman." It read, Truman Avery and June Carter, the truth finally told. When I walked through town that morning, people actually stopped me. Mrs. Hargrove from the bakery, who'd known my grandmother back in the day, held my hands in hers and whispered, she was such a good woman. I always knew there was more to her story. Even the mayor, a descendant of the Avery family, approached me at the Historical Society's memorial event. He was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with the same sharp jawline as the man in that old photograph. I don't know what to say, he admitted quietly. My family owes yours an apology. We've told the wrong story for far too long. I studied his face for a moment, searching for resentment, but all I saw was shame. And something else. Respect. It's not about blame anymore, I said softly. It's about truth. That's all my grandmother ever wanted. He nodded. Then let's make sure it stays that way. The Historical Society decided to hold a small ceremony the following week, to unveil a revised exhibit dedicated to both the Carter and Avery families. That morning, I stood beside my parents as the curator revealed the new display. 2 restored photographs, Truman's handwritten letter under glass, and a bronze plaque that read, in memory of June Carter and Truman Avery, whose love defied prejudice, whose truth endured time. The crowd applauded softly, and for the first time in years, my father smiled, not the quiet, polite smile he wore for others, but something real. Something lighter. When he turned to me, his voice trembled. She finally got her piece, he said. I nodded, tears burning behind my eyes. And so did you. That night, as the town lights flickered across Maple Hollow streets, I drove out to my grandmother's old cottage one last time. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear church bells. I walked to the oak tree, the one that had hidden her secret all those years. The grass was soft beneath my feet, and the stone I'd moved was still slightly out of place. I knelt down and placed a small framed photo, the one of her and Truman smiling, at the base of the tree. Your story's finally out, Grandma, I whispered. No more secrets. No more lies. A gust of wind rustled through the branches, scattering a few daisies across the ground. For a moment, I could almost feel her there, the faint warmth of her presence, proud and free. And I realized something then. Sometimes, the past doesn't haunt us to hurt us. It stays buried, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. I thought I was just uncovering a family secret. But in the end, I gave my grandmother back her name, and found out who I really am.